So, hello, everyone. My name is Lucas Mattila from the University of Cologne, the Center for Australian Studies, and the University of Dusseldorf. I would first like to thank WASIN, the University of California, Riverside, and the American Association for Australasian Literary Studies for bringing us together for this exchange of ideas. With thanks out of the way, I'd like to begin with a brief quote from near the end of Soon, the book I'll be talking about today. In this scene, the monster makes one of its earliest appearances in a flashback from its narrator, Pete. At first, it appeared to be merely smoke, or perhaps rain, approaching, but after a short while, it became obvious that this fog wasn't drifting in the usual way. It seemed to be writhing, seething almost obscenely. As it neared, it became more distinct. A mass of hideous smoky figures emerged, gliding along the street towards us. As the quote and the cover of the novel show us, this monster isn't just some scary mist, nor is it necessarily about what is inside that mist. Instead, the fog itself takes a form of multiple and singular, of the human and the non human. And with that positioning, I think we're ready to start thinking about what I and my colleague, Dr. Bettina Burger, that you have just heard speak, came up with together in one of our earlier collaborations, the EcoGhost. Today, I'll explore how Lois Murphy Soon offers one of the most prototypical examples of the eco-ghost, a figure that blends monstrosity and ecology, and how the presence of this figure in increasingly more Australian horror fiction indexes a shift in our priorities around the environment. I will argue, drawing from Soon as a case study, that the eco-ghost invites us to shift our attention away from the origins of slow violences, like environmental catastrophes, and instead move our gaze to more difficult and more urgent matters, addressing them now in our present. To do so, I will define the eco-ghost, explain why I picked Soon as our example, and then offer a reading of Soon's eco-ghost with an eye to Derrida's concept of hauntology. It's a bit of a full program, as we would say in Germany, so please feel free to ask questions if you need specific points elaborated on afterwards. For some academic context, the eco-ghost is not a secret jargon name that summons it if we chant it enough times, but it's a pretty declarative concept that connects to the work on the eco-Gothic, similarly named. Our conceptualization draws from eco-critical understandings of solastalgia and slow violence, but also adjacent concepts such as latency, hauntology, and slow horror. I'm not going to unpack all of that in this talk, thank goodness, but I want you to have an idea of some of the conceptual heritage that we're drawing from Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, from Jacques Derrida, from Rob Nixon, and from Courtney Trusack. To offer a definition for today, eco-ghosts are monstrous, ghost-like presences that straddle the line between supernatural and scientific. They blend ecology and monstrosity to signal the consequences of anthropocentric environmental harm. They can take the form of an avenging natural force, like in the film The Happening, or they might be haunting specters that underline ecological ills, as in the zombie film Cargo. Eco-ghosts spotlight solastalgic grief and nostalgic desires for a before-human past or an alternative present. Not always individual beings, or even ghosts, they can represent multitudes and embody the spectral thickness of the environment, to invoke Yves Titan. Nature's ghosts allow us to become more present in the here and the now. As liminal figures that inhabit the space between human and non-human, eco-ghosts channel our anxieties and fears to disinter past trauma and colonial legacies, not to point fingers, but to point to the problem and its preconditions. Some obvious examples that might be eco-ghosts in the Australian context include the ghost species, that is, both the Neanderthals and other resurrected animals, within James Bradley's novel Ghost Species, J. Kristoff's vampires in the Empire of the Vampire series, or even Deborah Sheldon's thylacines from her novella of the same name. Importantly, the eco-ghost is not a ghost because it takes the form of the ghost figure, but rather because it is imbued with ghost-like qualities. So now that I've offered a brief description of what an eco-ghost might be, I'd like to offer some context for the novel I've selected, rather than any of those examples I've just listed. I chose Lois Murphy Soon for 3 reasons. First, it has a strong connection to Australian cultural and environmental history, mainly because of its setting. Second, it's a great marker for talking about hauntology and how that connects to the eco-ghost. It will demonstrate the means by which an eco-ghost points to ongoing problems, rather than just the source. I also just like the book, and would like to provide some additional visibility to it. Now that you know why, I think we should get to the what. To sketch out the novel briefly, it follows Pete, an ex-cop living out his retirement, alongside a couple others that still remain in the former mining town of Nebula, specifically Millie and Lee, his neighbors. Set in 1998, the narrative oscillates between memories and its contemporary events as supernatural mists first drive away wildlife and then begin to devour the populace. As the mists feast upon the townsfolk, they are reborn as horrific specters within the mists, capable of speech and terrible acts of violence. Naturally, many of the inhabitants of Nebula leave the town, or they even commit suicide for fear of this fate. Soon is the story of a doomed rural town, and it centers on those who would rather not abandon their environment. It's about those who stay and suffer. By the end of the novel, it becomes clear that the force of the mists, the weight of environmental disaster, and the power of our eco-ghost is too much for our protagonists, as they are killed off one by one. The novel ultimately ends with Pete moments before his suicide to avoid joining the Mist's choir. Meanwhile, in the extra textual world, the one that we live in, the very real town of Whitnam parallels this town of Nebula, something that the author has actually brought up directly in an interview. The first thread of the narrative that became soon was the West Australian town of Whitnam. The town's livelihood had been asbestos mining, and the surrounding area was littered with tailings from the mine. So when it was discovered that asbestos was a deadly substance, the authorities decided the solution was to simply make the town disappear. So Whitnam was a town that mined blue asbestos in the 1930s, and you can already guess where this story goes from here. The roads were paved with asbestos tailings, and it was not uncommon for children to play in the asbestos or even chew on it like gum. There were poor working conditions in the mines and mill of the town, and there was a huge risk for cancer in the surrounding area, with an 80% death rate for cancer in Whitnam at one point. The mine was closed in 1966, and the town was gradually erased from public existence. Warning signs trying to keep people away were erected around what became a ghost town. By 2007, the town was taken off the street signs and the maps in an effort to dissuade some of the tourism to the area. Tourism which also actually occurs in the early portions of Soon. A few residents remained in Whitnam despite all of this, even into the 2000s. But by 2019, only one resident remained. I haven't confirmed if they're still living there now, but I tend to doubt it. The use of Whitnam as a cultural parallel to Nebula in Soon invokes the environmental discourse around the land, with its 3 mines and legacy of disaster. According to the ABC, 46,500 hectares of land, which was once a natural habitat for wildlife, has been covered in 3 million tons of asbestos tailings. In addition, studies have shown that, according to Melville, the impact on the Pilbara's Aboriginal people has been disproportionate. They have one of the highest mortality rates from mesothelioma of any group anywhere in the world. So we can say that the problem of the town of Whitnam greatly impacted the region of its traditional caretakers as well. We must question then, in Soon, what exactly it means that Aboriginal people are actually absent within the text. Is this a sign of erasure or an acknowledgement of the ways in which Aboriginal people are often erased? Well, it's not so simple. One might naturally assume that from what I've said so far, this basically clarifies the origin of Nebula's problem and the mist. The town of Nebula in Soon also has a mine, after all, and one that has been closed at that. But as I said, it's not so simple. You see, normally in a ghost story or any monster story, the origin is quite literally a marker for transgression and punishment. The starting conditions of Gothic text establish the symbolic order that will later be restored in some way. The bite of the vampire reminds us to stop kissing glittering strangers in the increasingly less rare moments of sunlight and forks. And the tragic murder that spawns a ghost tells us to stop murdering people so much. In other words, oftentimes, Gothic stories tell us to stop doing something that we are still doing now. But eco-ghosts don't do this, partially because what we have already done has already happened and is, for lack of a better term, history. We might expect then that Whitnam indirectly teaches us that mining is the culprit, and the Aboriginal absence in the narrative almost bolsters this point due to the connections between colonial history and mining. However, the text deals with this by articulating how the source of the fog may run deeper, and may reflect a deeper time scale than European colonial histories. Nebula had no indigenous population or known history, inconceivable in a region renowned for its climate, rainfall, and fertility. Blackfellas Don't Come Here should tell you everything you need to know. They read the lands through the soles of their feet, have done so for thousands of years. You don't have to understand it, just accept it. The quoted passage suggests that Aboriginal people have a deeper connection to the land and thus know the dangers associated with Nebula and its surroundings. If we take this at face value, it suggests that the mists are a regular part of the environment, part of a natural cycle, despite their supernatural dimension. If we reject that, it nonetheless indicates that Aboriginal people may have already experienced the mists once before, and then avoided them on pragmatic grounds. Like, hey, we don't want to die. And a natural cycle is further supported through the timing of the mists, as they begin and end with solstices. But these are by no means concrete answers within the text. In fact, the narrative actually suggests quite a few other causes. In connection to flows of capital that continue to displace rural folks, there's a rumor within the town that circulates rather quickly. You see, there's an appearance of some mysterious men wearing gray suits who drive dark SUVs and seem to arrive just before the fog begins to roll into town. They basically talk to no one, and nobody knows why they are there. Nebula's inhabitants speculate that they are in town to inspect a piece of land destined to become a supermarket tied to a major retail chain. The text goes as far as to say it's a corporate multinational Goliath. Arthur Rose, who writes about asbestos narratives, asserts that by associating the gray men with the ghosts directly, Murphy develops a clear trajectory between the nebulous investors of capital and the harm these investments bring. Since the harm is supernatural, Murphy can strip away all signs of actual industry from the town, which would only complicate the causal chain. Importantly, Rose is highlighting another possible cause of the mists and centering capital as a danger. But rather than providing us really a persuasive case, their argument merely offers one possible reading, one that comes in conflict with our previous one. There are, of course, benefits to taking this vantage, as it seems to point the blame directly at humans rather than any natural cycle, and thus kind of bolsters an eco-critical reading. But we'll come back to that in a bit. For now, I want you to understand clearly that the myths don't have a fixed starting point, and the narrative makes that explicit. You see, Pete, within this narrative, actually dwells on and discusses the difficulty in identifying any explanation or origin. Some would say that it began with the unwelcome convoy, but others would say it was merely part of a progression of events. Perhaps they introduced the myths, but were they really a beginning in themselves? Could you really, when you're dealing with a situation so esoteric, as ephemeral as mist itself, aim your focus at an obvious point and say, there is the beginning? To find a beginning is like trying to identify the onset of Alzheimer's. So easy to pinpoint the diagnosis as the instant of change. But beginnings will never arrive clean and weightless. They always come encumbered with a history. And this, you see, reveals the hauntological dimension of the EcoGhost, which is essential for reading the figure and its ramifications. For those of you who are unfamiliar, let me break it down. Hauntology refers to an ontological approach that does not emphasize being, but rather the spectral quality of the figure, which is both present and absent, living and dead, one that reflects a latent or belated status. In doing so, it marks a critical intervention in environmental and eco-critical discourse, and this is partially because of how hauntology is arranged. Hauntology, as Mark Fisher argues, often splits into that which is no longer, but which is still effective as a virtuality, the compulsion to repeat, a fatal pattern, but also as that which has not yet happened, but which is already effective in the virtual, an attractor shaping current behavior. In layman's terms, hauntology can be split into repetitive forms that echo again and again, or forms that have not yet happened, but which shape our current behavior. The haunting that occurs is either too late in the former case or too soon in the latter. In Yvonne Lieberman's work on haunting and latency, she highlights the spatial capacity of ghosts, how haunting is the energy of a space that registers that space's history, which chimes with a lot of what we've said so far. But more importantly, she touches on what happens when there is a disconnection of a haunting presence from its originary cause, using Derrida's hauntology. She writes, detaching the presence of a haunting past from singular events, hauntology works alongside the non-knowledge and the non-advent of an event. The ghosts do not reveal themselves or their motivation. Their disclosure thus remains an event in the becoming, an event never to be fully materialized. In Soon, the mist's origin is unknown, and what they are is porous and fluid. They are smoke, they are mists and fogs, they are animals and reanimated corpses. They are voices and it's weather. They are cooked up by men in gray suits and dark SUVs. They are capitalism and supermarkets, and they are mining and exploitation and colonial history. But they're also a natural cycle. It's something that's happened before, maybe, or maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's just something that people feel is off or not quite right. And the myths never do reveal their purpose or the mechanisms of their existence. We never get to see inside the myths to know how they work or who exactly caused them, if who did cause them. And in doing so, they demonstrate this hauntological capacity. In Soon, ontology teaches us what the EcoGhost is doing, and it is just what the title suggests. It is already effective in the virtual. Our doom is soon, but not yet. The hauntological logic to our EcoGhosts makes it evident that this is a multifaceted issue. It is one that connects to our ignorance of Aboriginal epistemologies and traditional knowledge, but it is also one that does not consider the deeper times of nature. It is one that is connected to neo-colonial and older colonial land exploitation, and one that is currently circulated through a global market system. Merely searching for the source of the ghost to exorcise is not what Soon asks us to do. It instead asks us to cope and to realize the urgency of our present, which is made evident in the fact that the belated narrative ends with Pete's attempt at suicide, something we are also unable to witness in the narrative. So to conclude, well-minded scientific and public discourse has dwelt on the causes of environmental harm. That much I think we can all say is true. But Soon insists that we face the consequences. The EcoGhost of Soon, its myths, warn us that danger is not in the past. It is already here, and it will not wait. In Soon, the disastrous outcomes of the EcoGhost have not been addressed by politicians, by scientists, and by broader society, just like with Whitnam, just like with our own climate crisis. This is, of course, not a problem just for Australia, but a problem for the world, and it is one that haunts us from the future. It's happening now, our behaviors are changing, and what happens next is hard to say. But we know that something will happen soon, and that this text has managed to manifest and articulate some of the anxieties we feel about our environment today, and the noticeable shift from origin to outcome. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to Wei Sin's turn.